Alright, so I'll be switching over to English, so please bear with me if I have to stop and translate in my head. If you have your Bibles or your phones with the Bibles on them, please don't be checking your Facebook. No, I'm just kidding. But if you have your Bibles, I'll be reading from the English version, English Standard Version, the whole of chapter 8, 17 verses. Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's troubles lies heavy on him, for he does not know what is to be true, what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has power to retain the spirit, or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wicked deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man has the power over man to his hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity, and I command joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God that man cannot find out, the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. All right, so we just moved apartments. It's gonna relate to the text. I'm just not telling you that we just moved. So we just moved from one apartment to another, and one thing that always surprises me is the fact that when you move, you always figure out something new or find stuff. For instance, I had been sort of paranoid of my dryer because it seems that he just eats up socks. And I'm always just one pair of many of my socks. And then when I moved, I found my socks in the weirdest places, which I blame Mikael for. He's probably taking them and putting them under the fridge and freezer and so on and so forth. And so I found my socks all over the place. At the same time we were moving the freezer, someone looked underneath the freezer, and there were about 50 letters that you're supposed to, like, magnetic letters that you put on the fridge. Well, Mikael had shoved them all down there, and they were all underneath the freezer. We found a bunch of pacifiers that we had long ago grieved over and thought would be lost forever. And so there are a lot of things that you find out when you move from place to place. One thing I found out is when I took a plant that was in the window of our kitchen and I turned it around, it had sort of a sticker on it. And so I thought it was a real plant, and I found out it's been a fake plant. And one thing that sort of, the reason why I was kind of shocked is because I thought this plant was dying for like 8 months. Because it looked like it was dying to me. So I don't know, maybe someone just kind of is a funny guy making fake plants that look like they're dying all the time, so that stupid people like me, water them for 8 months in hope that they will survive. But I found out the fake plant that I've been watering for 8 months has in fact been fake the whole time. And I don't know why it looks that way. Well, the way you view something changes a lot of things. So for instance, if you are the guy outside of the window and you see someone like me watering a plant and you see the sticker on the plant that obviously suggests that it is a fake plant, it might be laughable to you. If I was in that situation, I wouldn't even tell that guy, because I would just like to walk around in amusement as the guy sort of waters a fake plant. If you're the guy, sort of from my perspective, you're the guy watering the plant without seeing the sticker on the other side, it might not be a serious situation, but it would be more serious than a laughable situation from the guy outside. And so the perspective we have on life and whatever circumstances we go through, it changes a whole lot. It changes a whole lot. And so the reality is still the same. No matter if that situation with a plant is laughable or a little more serious than laughable, the reality is that whatever a guy does to a fake plant, no matter how much he waters it and so on and so forth, it's not going to change the reality that it's a fake plant, and it won't survive. Or it won't even live. I guess it won't survive at all. So no matter how much you give that plant water, it will not sustain. It won't be that way. It doesn't change a thing. And so our subject today is, what is our perspective on life? What is our perspective on in all these different circumstances of life, and how do they change we view life? And so here, this book in the English called Ecclesiastes, let me try to get this right. So it's written in Hebrew. Ecclesiastes is a Greek translation of the Hebrew that means the preacher. And so Icelandic is just way more simpler. It just says the preacher. But for some reason in American Bibles it's named Ecclesiastes. And here I hold to the idea that Solomon is the preacher. And we can debate that if you'd like, if you're that kind of nerd. But we can also just not. So we're reading Ecclesiastes. Here's the preacher, and he's going through life. And the amazing thing is that if you're a depressed person, I wouldn't recommend Ecclesiastes to you, because it just paints a picture of reality that is just bleak. There's no hope. And so he's sort of teaching you the value of a worldview with God in it from a negative perspective. So he's teaching you sort of like painting a picture of a bleak world where God is not central, so that you can understand that when God is central, all these things become nullified, become nothing. They are not the way he paints them out to be. And so he has talked about the purpose of life and the purposelessness of life without God at the center point. And he's taught us to seek the Creator rather than creation for joy. And so he's sort of painted a picture how empty life is without God, how vain life is without God, and then negatively pointed to the fact that with God, everything has purpose. How God redeems and changes oppression, how he changes that our loneliness, our slothfulness, and the vain things, that everything sort of disappears. Just if you leave a car long enough under a sun, the sun and oxygen will waste that car into nothing in a few years. It's amazing. Like really, everything literally is vanishing away. And the preacher here is teaching us that with God we have an eternal value that doesn't vanish over time. And so he is changing the way we view sort of the vanity of disappearing things. He says the love of money is a sad and bad investment, but the love of God is a great investment. He also points us to remember that in the sovereignty of God, in how great God is, we have comfort no matter what we go through, no matter what circumstances we go through. But today, he's dealing with the fact, do you see clearly? What is your perspective on different circumstances? What is your perspective on life? And so because perspective gives wisdom, how you view things gives you wisdom. And Solomon is always worried about his readers gaining wisdom, his son gaining wisdom in Proverbs and so on and so forth. So our perspective gives us wisdom. And he teaches us this lesson in 3 different points. He talks about righteous governance. He talks about having an eternal perspective, number 2. And then number 3, he talks about joy in the fact that when we don't understand. So these 3 points we're going to go over today. And Solomon here, King Solomon, is sort of giving us a recipe, following the recipe that he's done before in this book, where he paints a negative picture to show a positive picture on who God is. And so in the beginning of the text, in the first 9 verses, he has given us a sort of perspective on things under the sun. He talks about under the sun a lot in Ecclesiastes. And so he's making us look at created order and showing us sort of the hopelessness of, even if we just have eyes to see everything going on just around us. If that is our joy, then we're hopeless. And here he mentions a king, not positively. He mentioned a king that is sort of not a righteous king. It reminds me of a quote by John Dalberg Acton, who said, Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, for instance, if you see dictators, usually there's not just a good dictator who sort of gives everything that he owns away, except that one president somewhere in South America. Does anyone know who I'm talking about? He drives his car is like horrible, and he just lives on the land and so on. He's a great role model, but usually when you see dictators or men with power, they're usually corrupt. And of course, we live in Iceland, which is not corrupt at all. And so we have to sort of use our imaginations. I know it's really difficult to imagine corrupt people in power, but we can just imagine the fact that if we lived in such a country, how sad that would be. But here, in this quote, John Dalberg Acton, he says, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I have a problem with that, because absolute power, according to the text, according to the first 9 verses of the text that we're dealing with today, if you're a human being and you claim to have absolute power, it is an illusion. People may think that about you, you may think that about you, but that's an illusion. Because the one who has absolute power will not be corrupted, because the one who has absolute power is also absolutely good, and God is good. And so, in the first 9 verses, he's reminding us of the fact that people, even kings, even dictators, they may have power, but they will not have absolute power. And so, the man here is telling us that there's only one guy that has absolute power, and that is God himself. And earthly power may be a form of power, but it's never an absolute power. And usually with earthly power, we see an unrighteous usage of that power. We see the fact that whenever people get power, usually they let us down. Look over the presidents of the United States. For instance, just going back, my dad, I wanted to get a video game one time, and he made me memorize the names of like the last 10 presidents of the United States so I could get the video game. And I just memorized their first names, so it was all like Bill, and so it was fun. But if you look over the view of the presidents in the United States, and you see how popular they were when they came into office, and then how popular they were when they left office, you'll see a trend. They're always more popular before they start. They're always way less popular when they leave. And that's always because we think when we elect someone, we have certain ideas that he will use his power righteously, and then we figure out that he doesn't think the way we think. He doesn't always act the way we would like them to, and so we realize sometimes the person in power doesn't use the power righteously. Well, here he is painting us this picture, and for instance, in these 9 verses, he's saying, man, how we have seen power abused. But the fact is, no matter how powerful an individual is, he is not with absolute power. Every king will answer to the King of Kings. Every president, every prime minister will answer to the one who has actual authority. That whenever our life passes and we become mud and whatever, then we'll stand before the King of Kings and answer for whatever power we have been given in this life. And some may sort of think, That's not good. You should tone that down because you don't want your religion to sound harsh, that people will be judged by their actions and so on and so forth. And you see a lot of people selling Christianity on that point. There's no hell, there's no judgment, there's no nothing. Well, here, think about, for instance, our brothers and sisters in Iran or Saudi Arabia or North Korea or India or Syria. Think about the horror that is going on for people who are doing the exact same thing that we're doing here today. It's amazing to hear the stories of people, the only thing they do is say, I confess Jesus Christ as Lord. We had a story on this in Icelandic media not too long ago. I think this past week, someone from Iran, they denied him refugee status in Iceland, so he's going back to France and might possibly be going back to Iran to face a hanging for only doing what we do here today. Think about all the unrighteousness in this world. Think about, for instance, that there in North Korea, there's a system in place where a dictator can say, because you disrespected me, you and your children who are not born yet, and their children will be sentenced to hard labor their entire life. Imagine being literally born as a slave, live as a slave your entire life, and die as a slave, never seeing true freedom, never having the joys of just being able to govern your own body and use have freedom to love, have freedom to work for your own wages and so on and so forth. Imagine these people. Imagine, for instance, in Moldova. I think it's Moldova in English. In Moldova, for instance, where the sex trade is booming. There are people, a friend of mine, he's got a house there called Stella's house. And so he told this story about girls in Moldova. They go to, no one wants them, they give them up, and they go into these homes. Can someone help me with the word? Orphanages. And at 16, they're sent out with about $20 in their pocket and a bus ticket to the city they were picked up from. They've never been to that city. They go and they sit at the bus stops, and sex traffickers come and give them work. And then usually within 2 years, these ladies are either beaten to death or died from AIDS within, I think, 2 or 3 years. So he started a Stella's house where he can prolong getting girls off the street into Stella's house, getting them on their feet and so on and so forth. But imagine that. Or imagine someone who's born into, who's 9 years old, for instance. There's a museum that shows bloodied pants of a 9-year-old little girl who, her story was, she was 9 years old, been a sex slave for a year. She was raped 16 times a day. And in this museum, I think it's like A21 or the organization that has this museum, they're awakening to the fact that, hey, see the brutal, disgusting reality of the sex trade business. See this bloodied pants of a 9-year-old girl who was raped to death 12 to 16 hours a day, 12 to 16 times a day for someone's gain, financial gain. And then, if you're still, with these people in mind, if you still want to tell me that it's a harsh reality that one day they will stand before God and we will give an account for how we use our time, how we use our authority, and so on and so forth, then I don't understand you. But here he's pointing to the reality, the preacher. He's saying there's earthly kings who use their powers for disgusting things, for horrible things. They're unrighteous in their uses of their power, but one day they will stand before the King of Kings and they will give an account for every word that they uttered and everything they put in place. That righteousness will eventually win. And so, for instance, I've been a couple of times to a radio show host who's atheistic, and he talks about, hey, it's not too bad living as an atheist. I don't know what you're so scared of, and so on and so forth. It's a pretty freeing and a good thing to be an atheist. Well, maybe if you're a middle-class Icelander, you can say that. But what about that 9-year-old girl? What about the people who are born into labor camps and die in labor camp? What about all those people who never experienced being a middle-class Icelander? Never experienced going to IKEA during the weekends to shop for a new shelf, but rather they just are trying to find bread. Or just want to work for themselves so they can earn stuff and do whatever they want with the money. It's easy to say, hey, it's really good. It's a lot of freedom that comes with it and so on and so forth. Well, where's the righteousness? Where's the righteousness for the people who don't see righteousness in this lifetime? Of course, it doesn't rebuke everything that he says, but that's one problem I see with that worldview. But what wisdom does he leave for us? He tells us in verse 2, don't be quick to leave the king, pretty much. I'm paraphrasing this. Don't be quick to leave the king. And so, as Christians individuals, we're told in 1 Peter chapter 2 and in Romans chapter 13 to be subject to the governing authorities. And that remembering, well, here's a great thing, because remembering that he says, try to, you say, Varðveit, don't be quick, sorry, this is verse 3, don't be quick to walk away from the king. That there is a time when we walk away. And there is a time when we don't obey. For instance, China, when Mao took over, they sent out all the missionaries and all Christians were banned from the country. They still kind of are, but they're realizing they're like cockroaches. You smash one and just 10 appear. And they're realizing they're not winning the battle with Christians. China will be the most Christian nation in a few years. They will probably be sending missionaries to the West. But what we see is that he's saying, don't be quick to leave the king. There is a time when we do leave the king. For instance, we know a person who lives in Alabama who worked for many years smuggling Bibles into China. And so there was the fact where he was like, okay, I'm subject to the governing authorities, but when they say I can't worship my King of Kings, I will not be subject to your governing authorities. And so he's saying, use this wisdom. Be subject to a certain point. Don't be quick to walk away from your governing authorities. But remembering the fact that our loyalty lies first and foremost with God and the kingdom of heaven rather than the kingdoms of this earth. And so we are ambassadors of Christ before we are ambassadors of this Iceland or whatever your passport says. And so this wisdom, it corresponds with the wisdom of Paul and Peter to be subject to the governing authorities to a certain extent. And it may sort of stir an emotion in you. It's like, well, this isn't really revolutionary. This is stopping a bunch of revolution that needs to take place. Well, I would say to you that real revolutions don't happen with guns and swords. Don't happen with murdering one another. See Syria, see Libya, see all the places in the Middle East where, what did they call it? The Arab Spring started. Look at them now. There was a lot of passion in the air. There was a lot of weapons on the streets, and there are total ruins. Real revolutions happen when society changes, not in a political way. And so, for instance, last time I went to this atheist show, he asked me, why doesn't he speak against, for instance, slavery in the Bible? Well, he does. In a sense, in Philemon, he tells a brother who's going back to his slave owner who's a Christian, who says, don't view this man as a slave, view him as a brother in Christ. And what do you see? Over a period of time, as people start thinking through Christian terms, as that we are one of his brothers and sisters, slavery is eroded. He didn't go a political campaign, let's end slavery, but through changed hearts, society was changed, and through the change in society, politics were changed. So if you're sort of a revolutionary and thinking that this is stopping you from a revolution, it's stopping you from a stupid revolution. But if you want a real revolution, preach the gospel and see hearts changed. And when hearts and minds are changed, then you see real revolution taking place because things actually change for the good. If you see, for instance, Roman history, for the first 300 years, they were actively killing Christians. They called them martyrs. There were emperors who used Christians as they impaled them with sticks and burned them alive at their parties for fun. But then 311, Constantine comes and he realizes these Christians are cockroaches. They're everywhere now. I should probably become a Christian. Oh, this is my view of history, by the way. He apparently saw like a shadow of a cross and became a Christian. I think he was just scared that everyone was the Christians around him. And one thing I was hearing a guy talk about who's starting a church in Cuba where it's not allowed to start a church, or they're trying to deregulate, trying to kill the church. And he laughed when he said, it's funny, Castro is the best church planner that we have. Because they put laws in place where, oh, you can't have buildings. And so they started meeting in a bunch of smaller venues. Then they started regulating, oh, you can't be more than 50. And so they started splitting up more. And so it's like, oh, you can't be more than 20 at a time. And so they started splitting up more. And then now they can't meet unless they're in the living room. And so there are churches all over Cuba now because Castro has tried to kill the church for such a long time. And he's laughing, saying Castro is the best church planner that we have. By doing these things, we are all over the place. You can walk 10 steps and there's probably a church there. And so it's funny that when we see a real revolution take place, it's usually with these strange people who are somehow subject to governing authorities, but at the same time realizing that their ultimate governing authority is not of this earth. But the amazing thing is when he says in verse 2, be subject to the king, he gives us the reason how we do that. How do we do that with an unrighteous being king? It's because of who God is, not because of who the king is. It's because of who God is, because of the oath that you made to God. And this is the reason that all of life, the reason why we can go through difficult things and we can go through good things and like them well. We have to do them in view of God in everything that we do. And for instance, in Hebrews 12, chapter 2 and 3, chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, the writer of Hebrews, he says that Jesus Christ endured the cross. How? By viewing the things to come and the joy set before him. And then he says, as Christians, we should do the same. That we should not, in our difficulty, in our trying circumstances, or when everything is going well, how do we go through these circumstances well? It's by reminding us the fact that we do this all to the glory of God. It gives everything in life purpose. Even the most boring of jobs. Even mopping floors, do it well to the glory of God. It gives everything in life purpose. In history, the first 300 years of the Roman Empire, when they were persecuting Christians, a lot of Christians didn't get good jobs, for instance. A lot of them were sort of kept down economically to try to keep them down. Well, they did everything for the glory of God, and it's amazing to see. It's an amazing thing to see. And so we are reminded of the fact that we are subject to governing authorities, not because of the king, not because of how great the Icelandic government is, but because we trust God. We trust God that he is great, that he is good, and that he uses his power righteously. And so we may suffer for a while, but one day we will be in perfect joy, perfect happiness when we see the one who will wipe away every tear from our eye. Right now it may be hard for us, but we will go through it reminding ourselves that one day we will see our God face to face. And we will hold on to the promises of God that even in these dark circumstances where we can't see how they are good, Romans 8:28 tells us he works all things together for the good of those who are his children. And so we can sort of take from this, the first 9 verses, the motto of the Reformation, Soli Deo Gloria, which is a Latin phrase for to the glory of God alone. So when they worked, when they sought to teach doctrine, and it transformed economies. When John Calvin started to preach Soli Deo Gloria, people started changing the way they viewed their modern work. They started working well to the glory of God. So whenever you go to the gym, for instance, would help me. I'm losing a little bit of weight now. I just struggled for a long time because I just didn't see a point. Like I got my beautiful wife, and I'm like, I don't need no other eyes on me. I got the most beautiful lady in the room, just loving my belly. Which no, not really. But whatever you do, you can do to the glory of God. For instance, just gave me a different perspective when it said, okay, take care of your body to the glory of God. Because I just wasn't motivated when I saw these fitness magazines. I wanted to slap the guys in the faces for wearing whatever they wear to make them look so orangey. But it's like I didn't want to be that guy. And so I started viewing the gym as sort of, okay, do this to the glory of God. All of life is to God's glory. And so it gives purpose to everything. Whenever you go to work, even if it's a boring work, I struggled for 2 years in the most incredibly boring work of all. Luckily, I had some preachers reminding me in my ear, not just sort of standing around while I worked, but they were reminding me every day, everything you do it to the glory of God. Most incredibly boring job. Looking back now, it's amazing how God used that. When you're being a good wife or a husband, soli deo gloria, all to the glory of God. When you're being a good parent or a mother, as we celebrated you today, all to the glory of God. When we are subject either to someone around us, for instance, parents or our spouse and so on and so forth, or governing authorities, all for the glory of God. It gives everything that we have in life purpose. And so, Swava's getting really excited there. And so it is a thinking that goes nicely with the next thing as we move over to verses 10 to 13. And I'm probably going to have to cut this sermon short. So we need to ask us, first and foremost, what is wisdom? And so Solomon, who I think is writing this, he writes another thing called the Proverbs. And in chapter 9 and verse 10 of Proverbs, he tells us the beginning of wisdom is to fear God. And so this idea is to fear God is to revere God, to see him in the right light, that before him I am a sinner and he is holy, that before him I am unrighteous and he is righteous, and so on and so forth. To see him for who he truly is. And so Solomon, he says, the beginning of wisdom, if you need a starting point, view God rightly. And so these ideas giving that view him in the right light, view him for who he really is. And so in our earthly circumstances, it means that we might not understand him all the time. So a lot of people may equate wisdom to understanding what God has done, will do, and will do next. But that's not wisdom. Because if that were wisdom, then the pursuit of wisdom we would never get wisdom. Because some ways, for instance, when we go through suffering, sometimes we just have to go, why, God, do you allow this to happen? When you go through sort of you want to worship God with all of your mind and strength, but you just find that you have no strength. And you ask God, why do you allow this to happen? There may not in this life be a reason for it. You may not understand why. So if that were the pursuit of wisdom, we would never get wisdom. But wisdom is this, knowing who God is. Seeing him in his true light. And then, whatever circumstances we go through, he said, I don't understand these circumstances, but one thing I do understand is that God is sovereign. And God is over these circumstances. Whatever comes, whatever goes, I will trust that he is good, that he is righteous. And so, a part of trusting God is to be okay with not understanding everything that he does. In verses 10 to 12, we see Solomon counting up things that he doesn't understand fully. He's ungodly, they're buried. Well, the sinners, of course, we're all sinners, but those who sin and they don't repent, they live long lives and they prosper. Right? Can't do that. He sees unearthly, looks around himself, and he sees that evil is not punished, but the ones who fear God and those who are trying to worship God with their lives are. But in verse 13, he reminds us to have an eternal perspective on things. That righteousness in the end will conquer, will be above all. But what does that mean for us right now? We remind ourselves that in bad or good circumstances, we don't live for these circumstances. It doesn't matter how well life is going for you now. This is not where your true joy is found. In the finances that you get, for instance, we just got a new apartment. There's a lot of things to celebrate right now. And there will probably come a time when a lot of these things are pulled away. But what do I celebrate in that? When everything's going well, when everything's going bad, we remind ourselves that these circumstances, these passing circumstances, are not where our ultimate joy is found. As we can see when people say during circumstances, one day you will laugh at this. For instance, with me, one of my most shame, I had never been this ashamed of myself, is when I was in 7th grade. I had swimming classes, and I was getting late in, so I took a shower, and I was in such a rush that I ran out before my whole class when I realized I forgot to put the swimming trunks on. So I stood there naked before the entire class and just never coming here again. So I went and that was the most shameful act. But now when I reminded him, how could one forget to put on swimming trunks as he goes swimming? It was incredibly, but that's one thing that was very serious to me then, but now I laugh on the fact. And people say this, one day you'll laugh about this. And it's because we view circumstances right now as pretty serious. We cry or they hurt us and so on and so forth. But people know when time passes, it becomes less and less serious and even becomes funny. And so he's reminding us, I want to remind us, have an eternal perspective on things. You are an eternal being. So your current suffering, for instance, I know a few times I accidentally lit myself on fire, for instance, when I was 7. I ran into a wall and knocked myself out when I was 6. By the way, Dad, I didn't never tell you about turning myself on fire, but it was accidental and I was ashamed of myself. Then I think I fell downstairs, and it's just I went through I broke my hands 4 winters in a row because I was always horrible on a snowboard, and I always went for the biggest jumps first. And it just broke my hand in the beginning of winter and never got better on a snowboard. As these circumstances were in that current time, I was suffering quite a lot of suffering. When a girl didn't want you, where you had a crush on a girl and she didn't have a crush on you, and it was just devastating. Your whole life was just over. But now you look back and it's stupid kid, But what will my current suffering look like when I've been in glory with God who wipes away every tear from my eye? What will it look like 100,000 years down the road, looking at what I'm suffering right now? It may be the most serious thing you've ever faced in this life. It may be a disease that just got diagnosed or whatever. What will my suffering look like in the light of eternity? And what will my good times look like in the light of eternity? When I've seen God face to face and I know what pure, unadulterated joy looks like, when I know what 100% of full joy looks like, what will my current circumstances look like in light of that? When everything's going well financially or whatever it may be, from an eternal perspective, what would that look like? And so it gives us this point, be glad even when we don't understand. Because we have to have an eternal perspective on things. In that we see wisdom and we see who God is. And we know that He is sovereign, that He is good. And we may not understand why we're suffering. We may not understand why we feel this ache and why He won't take it away from us. But one thing we do understand, that He is sovereign and He is good. And one day, my current suffering or my current joys will be nothing compared to seeing Him face to face. And so, even though the work of God may sometimes be ununderstandable, we remind ourselves that we are the created being and He is the creator. And we are humbled in that fact. How can I not be humble when I realize that one over me has true authority? And we also have a reason to worship. The fact that we can't understand God fully means that He is more than you. He is more than you. He's more than you can understand. And if you have a God in your mind that you can understand fully, you're probably creating a God in your image rather than realizing that you are created in His. And so we have joy in that and we have comfort in that. And the question is, will we take this reality with joy with comfort, or with arrogance and anger? Will we say, God, you should do things my way? You should submit to my will? Or gladly say, God, I don't understand you fully right now, but I realize you are more than me. You are more than me. That's the question for us. To rub our eyes, to bend our knees and say, God, you are God and I am man. You are righteous and I am unrighteous. You are holy and I'm a sinner. To realize who God is and who we are. So sort of the homework that we have maybe this week is just to rub our eyes a little bit. See if we can see more clearly who God is. Study the Word of God. Realize who He is in the Bible. Just bend your knees and say, God, I may not realize or understand you fully, but I'm thankful for that because that means you are more than me. And with this right view of God, we can have joy in hardships and sufferings because we know they're temporary, because we look at them from an eternal perspective. But at the same time, when everything goes well, we realize that our joy is not satisfied in this. That our joy and our hope is way deeper than these passing earthly blessings. So, the beginning of wisdom is to see God for who He really is. And in that, we were reminded of the first verse where He says that our countenance, our face, our joy is changed. We may see this king who uses his power unjustly. We may not understand everything that he does. And we may have seen the righteous lose their lives early or go through suffering and pain and not understand. But we find joy in knowing that God is above these circumstances. And so our assignment as a church is to connect people up, in, and out. That's sort of our slogan. So up to personal, of course we know God is omnipresent, but to a personal relationship with God. Into a church, into a society of believers, and then out to tell the world about the hope that we have in Him. But if we don't see God for who He truly is, all these things are impossible. There's no way you can be in a personal relationship with God if you do not know who He is. There's no way you can be in a society of believers if you don't believe who God truly is. And there's no way to tell the world the hope that you have if you don't see Him in the right light. And so let us be joyful in who He is.